The protagonist, standing in the fire, watched her knights and looked around for someone surviving. But then her body weakened as well as theirs, so she fell to the ground. And looking around with a hazy eye, she realized that she couldn't save anyone and they were all dead. But her fate was her curse. So she was subjected to an endless cycle of death and rebirth each time, and so she lived for 1,000 years. The protagonist was once a high wizard. She also lived her life as a great swordsman, musician, painter, blacksmith, physician. She was also an aristocrat, was a queen and a saint, and also a witch who was burned at the stake. So the girl promised herself that the next time she was reborn, she had a goal for her 54th life. It was to be a sloth. As a result, the next time the girl opened her eyes, she found that she was suffocating and her whole body was stiffened by a huge pain, so that she immediately began to panic cough. And when she turned around, she realized that it seems that her 54th life had already begun. And so she got on the bed and thought that she should rest a little bit more because she was bored with everything and she just wanted to do nothing her whole life. But at that moment, her room burst into a madly disgruntled woman who called out to Ruvia Ruxin, asked if she was just now awake, after which she told the girl that she was as useless as her mother, and also weak. But Ruvia Ruxin herself is only displeased looking at her and thinking that she has not had time to be reborn and is already listening to some incomprehensible lectures from a woman who is still completely unknown to her, instead of just resting. But at this moment, this woman only grudgingly inquired why the girl just stares at her and does nothing. For she should have finally come to her senses and stood up by now, and inquired whether the girl had trouble with her head because of the fever. But she only disgruntledly looked at her and told the woman to shut up, because of which she was insanely indignant and shocked. And then to the protagonist slowly began to come to the memories of the past owner about who she was. Eventually, the girl was 18 years old and died of a fever, and she was the princess of an archduchy. And then the protagonist grudgingly wondered if princess wasn't the best status for a lazy life. At this time, a crazy, satisfied woman stood in front of her and, still shaking with discontent, wondered what the girl had just said. But Ruvia Ruxin didn't seem to be bothered by it at all, for she was still remembering the life of the girl in whose body she had taken up residence. And she noted that this girl had been completely ignored in her daily life, even by the servants. And her heartless stepmother and ruthless brother indulged in it. Also, the main character had a younger sister who was quite selfish in nature, and a cold and uncaring father who paid no attention to her. So this family was just as good as it could get. So she pondered what she should do to keep herself safe. At that moment, the insanely disgruntled woman shouted at Ruvia Ruxin and wondered how she could talk to her like that. She shouldn't be bragging about her bad blood, and wondered if she should have punished that girl properly so that she would finally come to her senses. But the protagonist realized that, if memory serves, it was the Archduke's wife Margaret. That is, the woman was her stepmother. So she rose from her seat and bowed and apologized. That she had just woken up and therefore hadn't come to her senses yet, and said that if my stepmother was done talking, she asked her to leave. Then she said that if her stepmother had anything else to say to her, she should have kept it to herself and left, because the protagonist was so tired. But the restless Margaret still yelled at the protagonist and wondered how she dared to insult her. She was a nobody in this house. But the protagonist only looked at her angrily and mentally stated that for a pampered aristocrat like her words would be an exorbitant pressure, and so she expected that the woman would now be scared out of her wits and leave. And at that moment, Marguerite, with shaking hands, clutching her dress, told Ruvia Ruxin to get ready, for she would surely punish her for her actions, and then turned around and thumped the door loudly and went out. And the girl just looked at her and thought that she was probably a lot tougher than she had planned, but she thought that in any case this situation would be solved somehow, because now she cared about something else. Then she went to the mirror and looked at herself and realized that she had shiny silver hair and eyes like jewels. And so she was insanely beautiful, just like a princess should be. Though with an unhappy exhale, I thought that being too attractive is also insanely tiring, because the title of princess and a beautiful face, this is something that clearly does not imply an easy life. And a more comfortable option for her would be to be rejected by a noble man, because the protagonist has already had such an experience. But afterwards, she decided that she should not worry about it for the time being. So she lay down on the couch and decided that she should sleep a little more comfortably now, because it had not happened for a long time. But the next moment the door to the room opened decisively and with a loud clatter, and a young man burst in and inquired of Ruvia whether all that his mother had told him was true. It was Marquis Sven, her brother from another mother, and also her father's eldest son. After which she stated that Margaret had brought her own help to punish her, so to speak. But at this point, the young man said that his mother had said earlier that the girl had behaved rather ugly and wondered whether it was so. And the protagonist just exhaled tiredly and thought about the fact that she just really wanted to rest and not do all this, and thought that these people were insanely annoying. Then she rose from her seat and looked at them sternly and realized that they needed to be dealt with as soon as possible, and to finish this conversation so she could finally rest. So she said that it was just like that, and she was being rude, then folded her arms across her chest and said that she had behaved inappropriately toward a person who called herself a mother, but was first to reproach and sarcasm her own daughter for nearly dying of a fever. At this point, the insanely disgruntled Sven reported that Ruvia Ruxin was really overstepping her bounds, and perhaps their mother's words had really upset her, but there was definitely no malice in them. But Ruvia Ruxin did not give up and said that she wanted to ask about something, after which Severe looked them over and asked what their lectures were about love for her younger sister, or all they just wanted the girl to show respect to the members of the family despite their attitude. But at that moment, Sven only stammered, unable to find the words to answer. And then Ruvia Ruxin said that her brother must have been at a loss for words at such a question. Either he would realize that he was being unfair to his sick sister, or he would admit that his own mother had been too harsh. At that moment, the man calmly looked at her and said that Ruvia Ruxin was wrong anyway, and she should change. But in Korean, the word apology and the word apple were one and the same. And so the protagonist said that in that case, she would give her mother an apple. So she should stop behaving like that, because if this woman liked fruit so much, she should go and eat as much of it as she liked. But at that moment, Sven looked at her carefully and asked her displeased with Ruvia Ruxin's behavior. But she asked where she was wrong. After all, apples were very good for health, and they say that it is enough to eat one a day not to get sick with something serious. Then looking earnestly at the young man and his stepmother, she said that they really ought to believe her, for she knew what she was talking about, and apples were very useful, and asked if her ladyship agreed with her, turning to her stepmother. At that moment, a madly disgruntled Sven turned to his mother and told her that it seemed to be time for them to leave. The woman was still not satisfied and told her son to finally deal with it, but he just calmly led her out of the room. And then Ruvia Ruxin observed that her brother wasn't so dumb as to realize he had to leave when there was no chance of winning, after which he began to lie down on the bed and wondered if she could finally get a good night's sleep, and eventually she drifted into her slumber, where in a meadow covered with flowers children were running merrily. Among them was, and the main character that smiling felt peace and true happiness. When the girl woke up, tears sprang from her eyes, and Ruvia Ruxin only stated that it had been a long time since she'd had this dream. So the first thing she did was ask Rue's boyfriend to bring her a handkerchief. But in the end, she was shocked to realize that this guy existed in her 53rd rebirth, and the girl still couldn't get used to breaking up with the one she loved. But after getting out of bed, she thought she should have eaten anyway. Food was a wonderful cure for sadness. Now was not the time to think about something like that. And finally, when she came downstairs, she saw the maids talking and discussing something. So she calmly looked at them and told them that they should bring her something to eat, and said that she would like medium rare meat and wine. Then she added that the wine should preferably be from the Dorbo winery and of the Livian variety. But the maid didn't even move from her seat, and then she grudgingly inquired why they were still sitting. And then one of them, laughing and with a sly smile, said that the food had already been finished, so there was no more food as it had all been put away. And the other maids just mocked the protagonist sitting behind the woman's back. But then the protagonist looked her over and said that in that case, they should have cooked her a new meal, and she was willing to wait. But she only asked in surprise what she meant. And then the protagonist, again with a maddeningly confident look on her face, wondered what was wrong, because she had come down later, and now she was hungry. so they had to do their job and cook for her. But the woman only exhaled unhappily and said that Ruvia Ruxin had been nothing but trouble. Then she turned haughtily and went to the kitchen and said that she would serve her food immediately. As a result, this time the girl did not make any remarks to her and just sat quietly in her seat, thinking that this problem could not be solved quickly. After all, this girl constantly tolerated all the abuse and did nothing about it. Then she thought that she should have eaten first, and then thought about everything else. But the next moment the maid rudely threw the plate on her table and said that it was the only thing left and wished the girl a pleasant appetite. But she only looked at her dish discontentedly and wondered if she had nothing more to say. And then the maid haughtily informed her that next time the girl would have to try to be on time as they could not constantly accommodate her idleness. But at that moment, the main character raised her seat and slapped this woman for such behavior. And when she fell to the floor, the protagonist examined her sternly and ordered her to rise, and then informed her that apparently the difference in their status was still for this maid obscure. And then she said that she was the first daughter of the Archduke, and therefore disrespecting her was equal to disrespecting the Grand Archduke. And looked at her fiercely. She wondered if this maid had a few more spare lives stashed away. At that moment, the woman shook with fear and said that she would never dare to show her the slightest disrespect. But Ruvia Ruxin was skeptical and then looked around at her accomplices to see what they thought of the situation. And at that moment, Onai immediately also fell on her knees and reported that they had indeed been wronged and asked the girl to have mercy. And the head maid immediately bowed and apologized to Ruvia and said that they would prepare everything for her right away. And at that moment, the protagonist calmly sat down at the table and said that she was giving them one more chance to improve. They bowed and went straight to cooking. They ended up doing everything is fine the next time, and Ruvia Ruxin thought about that even though she scolded the head maid in front of everyone. But anyway, people here ignore and antagonize Ruvia. And there are many ways to make a difference, like getting favor through good deeds, or being cruel and destroying your enemies. But the main problem was that it all required the force, and even if the protagonist got people on her side, she'd still be given away in an arranged marriage as soon as she came of age. As this girl already had a fiancé, the fourth principal of the Western Empire, an exceptional figure who had amassed enough power to threaten the crown prince without even having the right to succeed him. The most prominent fiancé in the entire western part of the continent. And then the protagonist unhappily thought that this life would definitely go wrong if she married the fourth prince, so she definitely shouldn't let that happen. But the next moment, distracting her from the morrow, a knight came to her and bending down informed her that the great Archduke was calling her to him. At first, Ruvia Ruxin was surprised, but afterwards she thought that in principle such a situation was even very fortunate and told the knight to escort her. Then she thought that now she would go and immediately cut ties with this family. Eventually, when she found herself in her father's study, she curtsied and announced that the eldest of the daughters welcomed the Grand Archduke. And then the man seemed to turn around with great displeasure and coldness, and looked at the girl. And at that moment, the protagonist thought that this is exactly how the ruler of the great Archduchy looked. And just by even one look at this man, one could realize that he was flawless. And then the man looked at Ruvia Ruxin carefully and said that today she was surprisingly not trembling with fear, but she calmly said that she was not guilty of anything and therefore had no reason to worry. And then the man, sitting down at his desk, said that Ruvia Ruxin had somehow changed, as if she had become a completely different person. And the protagonist herself only awkwardly thought that in fact she was. But after a serious look at the man in front of her, said it was just growing up. After all, she was getting a little taller every morning, and her character seemed to be changing just as rapidly. And then the man, calmly looking at her with some sadness, said that they had not seen each other for a long time enough that he had not noticed how she had changed. And Ruvia Ruxin only thought that his reaction was strange enough, because she was sure that this man would not like the changes in her. After which the protagonist thought that her own mother was not from a noble family, but the love of the Grand Archduke was so great that he wanted to take her as his wife. However, if the daughter of the beloved woman was to die because of fever caused by all sorts of neglect from society, as well as humiliation from her stepmother, so she was madly curious as to why this man was doing absolutely nothing about it. But he looked at her and asked if she understood why he had called her, but she just calmly said that she had a few guesses. But he looked at her seriously and said that he was not going to scold her or reprimand her, but he said that he was not going to tolerate unnecessary noise in his house, so the girl should try to make sure that it would not happen again. At first, Ruvia Ruxin was silent for a while, but afterwards she looked at her father without looking at him and wondered if he was suggesting that she cover the festering wound with a rag and ignore it. Because there are two ways to heal wounds. The first is to take the medicine little by little and wait for it to heal. And the other is to just squeeze out the pus and get rid of it. But since it's too late, we should go with the second option. So she resolutely declared that from today, she was leaving the Archduchy. The agitated man who had been standing silently listening to their dialogue turned to Lady Ruvia and asked her what she was saying. But the father only grudgingly inquired whether the girl thought he would listen to her words. But she calmly stated that even if he didn't want to listen to her, he still had to listen to her. He was the cause of the wound. Then looking into his shocked face, she told him that she had known for a long time that she was an eyesore in this house, and that if she stayed, this wound would never heal and they would continue to hurt each other. But there was no answer from her father, so after a little silence, Ruvia Ruxin said that she would assume that he agreed and that she would leave their house within today. Then she curtsied and asked her father to take care of himself and walked away. When the door was closing behind her, her father panicked and got up to stop her, but the door slammed immediately afterwards, so he stayed where he was, just watching the door close. And the protagonist, who had just left her father's office, only thought about the fact that her father didn't even try to detain her, although in principle, such a development was convenient for her, but sadly confessed that the owner of this body was a crazy, unhappy child and promised that she would definitely live this life happily for this girl. Then returning to her room, the protagonist began to pack her things decisively. Then looking at the collected suitcases, she stated that all the clothes she had already put, as well as the blanket that will be instead of a sleeping bag. Jewelry she did not have any, and money could be earned. So in principle, the minimum stock would be enough for her. Then she put on her traveling cloak and began to go downstairs. And at that moment, an unexpected question was heard, and the man inquired what she was doing now. Eventually, at this time, the Archduke's counselor turned to inform him that the princess had already left their mansion and wondered whether they really shouldn't stop her. But the man only turned to the knight behind him and ordered the young man to watch the princess until she came back. And that shouldn't take too long. He, having listened to the order, raised his head at the man and asked the Grand Archduke what he should do if the princess really did decide to leave the Archduchess forever. And then, with a maddeningly puzzled look, the man said that in that case, the knight should have brought her forcibly back home, and he swore that he would carry out that order. And then he left at once. And left alone, the counselor asked the Grand Archduke what he would do if the princess was held against her will. For he understood the man's feelings, but the princess was innocent. And then the Grand Archduke stated that he understood that the girl was not guilty of anything, and the counselor only thought that the princess had behaved completely differently before, for she had always been madly depressed and quiet, but today she looked resolved to be neither. And so it seemed to the counselor that the girl had gone away from them forever, so far away that they simply could not reach her. In the end, the one who approached the protagonist was her brother, who scrutinized her and asked what she intended to do, but she calmly explained that she was leaving the mansion. Then she said that it seemed to her that this was the only way, because there were no better options. And if there were better options, the whole situation would not have gone this far. Then passing her brother, she calmly informed him that she would be on her way and asked him to be in good health. But at the last moment, he grabbed her hand and put a gem in her palm and asked her to take it. It was an amulet with the seal of the Grand Archduke, and if the girl got into trouble, she had to use it. In the end, the protagonist looked at the artifact and thought that it had a great amount of magic. That's why Sven offered to use it in case of an emergency. But Ruvia Ruxin herself thought that it was necessary to try so hard for Ruvia when she was alive, because now it was too late. Then I took one last look around the house and said goodbye to the family, determined to leave and never come back. The next moment, she was stopped by the voice of the crying maid Maria, who, taking a huge bag with her, asked her mistress to wait, for she wanted to go with her. After which she cried even more and wondered how her mistress could leave her alone, for she could not live without her. And the protagonist, looking at the sad face of her maid, wondered if she had forgotten all about her. Even though the child was the only one who stayed by Ruvia Ruxin's side until the end. But afterwards she looked at Maria carefully and said that she should go back, because she would have a hard time with her. But she said that she promised that she would be of great help and begged the protagonist to take her with her. And she only looked at her maid uneasily, wondering why she was so stubborn. I mean, you can't expect anything good from her. But at that moment, the girl literally glowed and said that she liked her mistress a lot. And at that moment, the protagonist seemed to be struck by power, for she immediately recalled a young man from a past life, who in the same way, in response to her question about the reason for the protagonist's pursuit, the answer was obvious enough, for he liked her. It was her lover, Rue. But after the main character approached Maria, she patted her on the head and agreed to take her with her if she wanted to so badly. And she literally glowed with happiness and thanked her mistress for giving her permission. And it seems that this was indeed the happiest event for this girl. And as they walked along the road, Ruvia got a stomachache because she hadn't eaten anything in a long time. So she asked her maid if she had any money, but she only awkwardly said that she did have some money, but that she had spent it on cakes. And then she said that she would earn it anyway, because she was madly capable and it would not be difficult for her to get any money. And then the protagonist, only scrutinizing her maid, thought that this girl was insanely cute and asked if she had cakes. She only surprisingly said that she liked strawberry. Then the protagonist approached and asked what else the girl would like to eat. And she said she also liked the veal steak and filet mignon. She'd never actually tasted them, but she'd seen the owners eat them. She was insanely jealous. And then listening to her carefully, Ruvia Ruxin smiled and told her maid that in that case, they would have filet mignon and strawberry shortcake for dinner tonight. She only excitedly asked where they would get the money. And then turning around to go further, the protagonist reported that money could always be earned. And an excited Maria, looking over her mistress, asked what she planned to do and whether she was about to do anything wrong. But the protagonist only smiled and going forward called her maid to follow, without answering her question. In the end, after a while, the protagonist found herself in the city where, together with Maria, went into one of the establishments and madly surprised maid only wondered whether her mistress had some business in such a place, because it was strange that she chose this particular store. In the end, when the protagonist entered, she was immediately met by a salesman who asked her what she had come for, but the protagonist only calmly looked at the harp and asked if she could borrow the instrument for a while. But the man took the harp in his hands and said that their establishment doesn't rent it. But insanely calm Ruvia Ruxin said that she would give him 5 coins for 2 hours of harp use. And a frantic Maria immediately informed him that the harp itself was worth 10 coins. So there was no point in taking it for that kind of money. But the protagonist didn't answer because she was absolutely sure of her choice, and still looked at the salesman with a smile, waiting for his answer. And finally, he couldn't stand that look and said that he was ready to borrow the tool. And finally, the protagonist left the store and went to the square, while the worried Maria only wondered why her mistress had a harp and what she was going to do with it. But Ruvia Ruxin calmly explained that she needed the harp to earn money. Then when they got to the right place, Ruvia Ruxin took a hat out of her suitcase and asked Maria to support her a little, and to turn the hat over so that she could put the money in it. Then she sat down in her seat and gently ran her fingers over the strings of the harp, checking how well the instrument was tuned and how well it sounded, and then she began to play. At that very minute, the aristocrats and the common people could literally not believe what they were hearing. After all, no one expected that there could be such a talented musician on the street. And the protagonist, who was playing and enjoying the instrument, was just thinking about how nice it was to play the harp again. Because in her previous life, she couldn't even touch the instruments because she simply didn't have time for it. In the end, moments later, a crowd had gathered around the girl, who listened to her music mesmerized, enjoying the concert. And people threw a few coins into the hat to thank the musician for such a talented performance. In the end, when the protagonist finished her melody, she bowed and thanked the audience for listening to her. and those who were madly happy admired such talent and applauded. But at that moment, suddenly a man shouted that he would like to take the girl to give a concert in his house. But the other disgruntled aristocrats shouted at the man to stay out of line. And another man asked if the musician would like to be the real musician of their house. But at that moment, while people were fighting among themselves, this noise was taken advantage of by the protagonist, who excitedly pushed Maria in the back and ran away with her to get away from the crowd. In the end, they walked down the street while Maria counted the money, and it turned out that they had earned 300 coins. Ruvia Ruxin only thought that such a sum of money was similar to a month's salary for an ordinary citizen, which was not bad enough. And then Maria carefully looks over her mistress, said that she had never seen the girl holding a musical instrument in her hands, so was madly surprised that the protagonist was able to play so well. The girl's excuse was that she was a genius. That wasn't a problem for her. When she heard that, Maria glowed and said that she had always suspected it, because the protagonist always looked as if she lived in her own world, so it was no wonder she had so many talents, and Ruvia Ruxin looked at her and was glad that Maria believed her and did not try to find out the truth. After that, the protagonist looked at the hat full of money and told her maid to keep an eye on and be responsible for all their savings. After all, she was the princess of the Archduchess and therefore could not control the finances. So it was Maria who had to do it. And she was so happy to hear that the princess trusted her so much that she told the girl that she would do her best to keep everything under control. They ended up going to a rather expensive place, and then Maria worriedly asked why they had gone to such an expensive place. It was not necessarily for her sake. But Ruvia Ruxin calmly said that it wasn't because of Maria. It was because she wanted it. She thought it would be better to say so that the girl would not worry. Then Ruvia Ruxin added that she also liked sirloin steaks and strawberry shortcakes, so Maria should not jump to conclusions. And so, literally glowing with happiness with tears in her eyes, thanked her mistress and promised that from now on she would try even harder to live up to her mistress. But she looked awkwardly at the maid, so cheerfully asked if she thought her so abrupt change in demeanor strange. But the girl thought about it for a while, also smiled brightly and said that of course it was quite surprising, but everything was fine because Ruvia Ruxin was Ruvia. Then looking carefully at the princess said that she liked it even better with the girl now. But then excitedly added that it didn't mean her character had been wrong or bad before. It's just that before, Maria's heart was literally torn apart every time she looked at the main character, because she looked lonely and grief-stricken. But afterwards she smiled and said that she liked everything about her, both the way the heroine used to be and the way she was now. And Ruvia Ruxin only smiled and mentally thanked her so faithful maid. At that moment, Maria looked at the protagonist more seriously and asked her what she planned to do next, and whether she would still be a wandering musician. But she calmly informed him that it wasn't part of her plans, and with a smile added that they were to go to the Linet. It was a free city. On Earth, the Western Empire, which belonged to no one. 200 years ago, it was just a village. Now it's the most important city on the continent, all thanks to the prestigious Linet Academy. And the Linet Academy is an institution of higher education with many specialties where teenagers from the age of 20 study. And it's a place that the protagonist has a lot of memories of, since she founded this academy in one of her past lives. Finally, when they finished eating, the girl went to pay for dinner, but then asked if they had a room on the top floor for the night. The girl behind the counter with a smile asked which room the girl wanted to choose and whether she wanted to stay alone. And then Ruvia Ruxin said that it was better to have one room for two. And a frantic Maria only wondered if I really planned to stay here. But Ruvia calmly said that they would have to get on the ship in the morning to get to the city. And since they had to catch the first flight, they would spend the night here, since it was closer. In the end, an employee of the hotel came to take the girls' things to their room, and Maria, who was still running after the protagonist, said that the place was really expensive and they still had to buy tickets in the morning. But Ruvia Ruxin calmly explained that Maria should not have worried so much. After all, she had already calculated everything. In the end, after a little more time, the protagonist lay down and took a bath, and then Maria asked her mistress why she wanted to go to this particular city, and was she going to go to this academy. And she calmly looked at her and told her that it was just like that, because it was freshman orientation. That's why she wanted to take the entrance exams. At this point, the girl literally glowed and said that it looks insanely adorable because the main character is so eager to follow her dream, and it looks insanely uplifting. But Ruvia Ruxin saw it from a different perspective. It was the first step towards her life as a slacker, because if you enroll, food and lodging are free. And since education here is skill-oriented, if you do well on the test, attendance won't matter. So this would be a great way out. And at this moment, Maria literally Shone asked if the protagonist already knows what direction she would like to enter, and perhaps she liked the direction of the artist, magician, or doctor. Although she thought that the princess would perfectly fit the specialty of even an engineer. But the protagonist came downstairs quietly from her bathroom and said she hadn't decided yet. And it was worth thinking about. She thought about the fact that she was going there for a vacation, not to think about studying. After all, a few years of free food and idleness was the best she could think of. But afterwards, she saw Maria looking madly cheerful and asked what her cheerfulness was about. She calmly explained that she was in a good mood because she had tasted filet mignon for the first time today, and tomorrow she would board a ship for the first time and go to the famous city. What made her especially happy was that it was all happening with her adored mistress, and she smilingly looked at the embarrassed girl in front of her, stroked her head, and promised that when they arrived at their destination, the princess would buy her something tasty to eat, like her favorite strawberry cakes. As a result, the next morning Maria had already packed her bags, and Ruvia Ruxin calmly looked at her and said that they also had to buy something for the journey. After all, they had to sail for 3 days, so they had to prepare in advance. Then the protagonist resolutely opened the door where the knight who had been following her had been and looked at him unhappily. Then she came closer, and then he tried to hide his face and pretend that he did not know the main character at all. But they calmly said that he should not pretend, because she knew perfectly well that he had been following them since yesterday. Then hearing this, the knight bowed to greet Lady Ruvia Ruxin, and she only quietly inquired what he needed. And then the agitated man emphatically announced that the Archduke had instructed him to ensure the girl's safety. And so he asked her to treat him with understanding as he was forced to follow her. But she calmly looked at the man and told him that she had no idea to send him away, and that since he had been working hard, he should come in and have tea with them. But at this moment, while the protagonist was preparing tea, a worried Maria only asked what would happen if this man decided to capture them. But Ruvia Ruxin did not answer this question because she realized that even if she spoke insanely quietly, such a famous mana wielder as a knight would hear every word. Then pouring him a crumb of tea, offered him to drink it and accept it from her and Maria as a token of gratitude for his work. The latter thanked the girl after that, unsuspecting, immediately sipped it, and informed me that I should have gone back to the duchy, but calmly informed me that she wasn't interested, and she was really going to go to other lands on today's ship. But at this moment, hearing such, knight resolutely declared that he simply could not allow something like this. After all, the Archduke ordered him to bring the protagonist back home even against her will, so the girl couldn't just leave his domain. But she only remarked in surprise that the fact that her father had ordered her back was quite unexpected. But after calmly informing him that she understood the knight, for he was obliged to carry out the order. And he literally thanked the protagonist for shining and informed that in that case, they should have returned to the Archduchy now. But Ruvia Ruxin calmly informed that the man should have entered her situation too, just as she had entered his situation. And the next moment, everything began to swim in front of the man's eyes, and he fell headlong against the table. And at that moment, Maria ran up to him frightened and asked her mistress what had happened to the man. But she calmly said that Maria should have left him alone because the knight was probably tired and had fallen asleep. And the girl looked at the clock behind her back and thought that the remedy she had used had worked perfectly, and it was indeed a good sleeping pill. But then Maria looked at the young man in surprise and wondered if he had fallen asleep because he was so tired. Ruvia Ruxin said that she did not know for sure, but in any case, she should have put the knight to bed so that he could get a good night's sleep. In the end, they did so, and before they left, the girl turned around one last time and looked him over, remembered that this knight was considered the most outstanding of all mana wielders. But he decided to drink tea from the object of surveillance, so it was declared to be quite naive. And in the end, she closed the doors, leaving the knight to sleep in peace. And for forgiveness, she left him a letter which said that the girl had left the payment for the accommodation on the night, and she hoped madly that such a situation would not happen again. In the end, already on the ship, the protagonist thought that it was a punishment for the actions of a young man and not because she did not want to pay. At least she tried to convince herself of this. In the end, some more time passed, and madly happy Maria, looking at her mistress, reported that on the horizon already saw the city. And madly tired protagonist stated that after 3 days on the ship, all her body literally stiffened, and she felt insanely tired. But Maria did not stop admiring the view and suggested to the protagonist to see how huge the port of this city was, and everything looked really marvelous. But Ruvia Ruxin reacted to this quite calmly. So Maria asked if she wasn't surprised at all, but she calmly said that she too was surprised by the sight. But Maria immediately said that her mistress was lying. And then the protagonist stated that she really had nothing to be surprised about. After all, it was not the first time she had seen such a large city. Then she recalled one of her memories, when a little boy took her hand and asked her if their teacher would really live in the house with them. And she calmly informed that this is now their place of residence. Then looking around the small building, the children asked if in the future there will be a school built here, and asked the girl how she plans to name it. But the girl calmly looked at the children and said that she hadn't come up with a name yet. And she wondered if the children had any suggestions so that they could choose a name together. But out of them stood out one of the boys who proposed to name the school Lynette, but the excited girl asked them to choose some other name. And then the children, looking her over carefully, said that no other name was possible, and they wanted their school to be named in her honor. And then I remember that the main character stated that it was a small school for 5 orphans. And at the time, she had no idea that this school would be the best on the continent, and realized that even after living at Lynette Academy for 1,000 years, she would be insanely happy. Although after looking at everything that surrounded her, the protagonist stated that 200 years had already passed, so there was almost nothing left of the past. But all this, even her, a little cheered her up, because the world was moving forward with her. She ended up going to the academy and was told she was registered and her test would be in a week. And a frantic Maria looked at the protagonist and wondered if she was worried. But then she assured her that everything would be fine and her mistress would definitely pass. And even if she doesn't pass, it won't make any difference. So if she fails the exam, they will do something else. And it won't be hard for her to earn money. But Ruvia Ruxin calmly looked around so resolutely the girl said that she really shouldn't have worried. After all, she seemed to have forgotten her abilities. Then the protagonist's gaze focused on all those students and she thought that crazy talented kids came here from all over the West to take the entrance exams. So there was a lot of competition. And the level of knowledge had changed a lot in 200 years. So she thought that even though she was old and lazy, she'd have to study. She smiled happily and wondered if Ruvia Ruxin had decided to study a little, and said that she would take the bags to their room and waved to her. And so the protagonist went to the library where she picked out the necessary textbooks. Her eyes shot to one of the thickest ones, with the title discussing the humanities through an understanding of human history and philosophy. And then, after reading the title of the book, the protagonist confessed that this title alone made her tired. But after opening the book, she started reading and noticed that, to her great surprise, it was very interesting, and she didn't understand why she liked it. But after relaxing, completely immersed in the book, and thought it was probably because she hadn't read for pleasure in a long time, for her former life was too violent and filled with grim battles, plots of blood and death, and in those days one of her wishes was to be able to read in peace. And that wish seems to have come true in this life. So she smilingly read not the first book on her list and said that it was much more interesting to read books than documents. But afterwards she decided that she should get some rest. And going outside, she did a little warm up for her muscles. But suddenly, there was a voice calling her name. It turned out to be a pink-haired girl who smiled and said that at first she wasn't sure if it was Ruvia Ruxin in front of her, but she wasn't mistaken. Then she said that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. Then they greeted Lily Ruvia Ruxin and said that her name was Janet and she was the daughter of the Marquis. And she said that it was quite surprising. She had not expected to meet the famous Princess Ruvia Ruxin of the Archduchy in such a place. and then smilingly inquired as to the reason why the girl was at the academy and whether she had decided to take the exams, and then said that she was literally admiring the bravery of the protagonist. After all, perhaps such a choice would make her father angry. Then tragically and theatrically announced that it is a great honor for any family if any member passes the Lanit Academy exam. However, one could also dishonor the name of one's house by failing. The protagonist herself thought that Janet did not mean exactly what she said, and her true thoughts were that the shallow Princess Ruvia Ruxin was a disgrace to the Archduke and a mockery of society. So she did not understand why such a girl would try to pass the entrance exams to the Linet. After all, she would fail, and she was not brave enough. Then the protagonist stated that the girl in front of her is the daughter of the Marquis, and her father is one of those who support the power of the empire, and you can say that her father was a great aristocrat who is not far behind her father in importance. But after we exhaled, we thought about how the purest thing she'd ever seen was blood. And here was a girl who looked crazy like cotton candy, and it looked nice enough. But then Janet saw her smile and asked Lady Ruvia what it meant. And then the protagonist thought she could have a little fun with this girl. So she said that, according to her, Janet was not afraid of failing the entrance exams. And then this girl proudly proclaimed that she had prepared hard, and so she had no fear. Then the protagonist looked her over and asked if she could ask her a couple of questions, because she had recently read a book and was confused. And Janet, full of self-confidence, said that the protagonist could ask as many questions as she liked. And then the protagonist asked, how did the Khazanate issues affect the future generation in the war to liberate the Southern Empire in 524 on the host calendar? But Janet only informed her that it was an insanely weird question, and began to talk about the results of liberating the Southern Empire from the Northern Empire. But the protagonist shook her head and said she didn't need to talk about the results of the war because she was asking about Khazan's participation in the slave emancipation movement, which influenced not only Southern society but Eastern society as well. But an indignant Janet said that this is what she was going to say and was madly embarrassed and outraged that she was supposedly interrupted from her thoughts. And then the protagonist did not argue and inquired about the Findler theory on the refraction of light and inquired how they should set the beta factor when placed in the value of the differential in the 38th equation of sigma 178, 2343 or sigma 178, 2345. But seeing Janet's madly surprised face, she immediately realized that the girl would not be able to answer this question, so she asked about the paradoxical reaction of the sympathetic nerve in the physiological response to the body. But then she saw how badly the insanely disgruntled Janet was shaking and realized that this seemed like an inappropriate topic for bullying this girl. So she carefully flew her off and asked if Janet had been well prepared. But she was about to say something but could not find the right words. So the protagonist smilingly thanked the girl for worrying about her, but warned that the girl herself seemed to need some more reading and asked her not to think that she was doing and saying this out of malice, because she really cared about the girl. And she just turned around and started to walk away, and seemed to feel insanely depressed about her such a high-profile failure, especially when you consider what she had said and thought about the main character herself earlier. And the protagonist thought that maybe she should have pressed harder on this girl, because if she continues to try to bully her, it will be exhausting. But after thinking about this girl, Ruvia Ruxin decided that Janet will lose to her anyway, although she felt sorry for such a nice girl. Then stretched tiredly and thought she was insanely hungry and decided to treat herself to something tasty in honor of her good workout. As a result, a week later, Maria waved happily at the protagonist as she sent her to the exam and informed her mistress that she needn't have worried if she failed, and most importantly to keep her happy and not to push herself. Finally, when they were all seated in the auditorium, the voice of the exam supervisor announced that they had started. And then the protagonist started the assignment. But she was shocked to notice that all these assignments were too easy and didn't know what to do. After all her efforts were too hard. And then she realized that she'd forgotten what the passing score was. And if she got it right, it would attract a lot of attention. Then she turned around and looked at Janet and said that looking at her pretty face, one could tell that the assignment was really easy. So she decided that she had to score 90 points. And so she will pass the exams without attracting any personal attention. And then she thought about the fact that from today, her real life as a sloth begins. Then she went home satisfied after completing her exam. And Maria kept talking about how anxious she was about the results. Although with a smile, she turned to the main character and said that she didn't doubt her one bit, but the level of competition was quite high. And then the protagonist only smilingly said that everything would be fine because she was a genius, and success in the exam was already guaranteed. And then she thought that she had scored exactly 90 points, and that should be enough. And then Maria said with a smile that she was worried sick. Everyone said that the exam was crazy hard, so she was worried. But at that moment, madly shocked main character literally jumped up from her seat and asked what the girl meant. And then Maria said that on the way she heard from other guys that for the last 50 years it was the most difficult exams, and say there are those who have no sense to wait for the results, so they just left. And then the shocked girl thought that 90 points was probably too much in this situation, but she didn't understand how this could have happened. After all, this place should have gathered all the talents of this continent. And then she wrapped herself in a blanket and thought that she shouldn't have worried too much. It wasn't clear yet, so she hoped she'd be right, and there would be people who would write better than she did. Finally, when the results were ready, they went to check. And then they noticed the crowd of people and realized that those who were crying must have failed the exams. Ruvia Ruxin admitted that she was even a little worried. Then, approaching the person responsible for announcing the scores, she gave her name, and the woman was shocked and asked if it was really her. After which she joyfully jumped up and said that they had been waiting for her madly and asked her to open the envelope as soon as possible. And she just thought she had a madly bad feeling. Then she was not satisfied with what was written there, namely that she scored 90 points, and she had the best result because 90 points was the highest score of all. But the next moment, Janet came up to them and told Ruvia Ruxin that they had met again, and asked how the girl had passed the exam. She said that the girl didn't have to answer because she could see it in her face. And she said that Ruvia Ruxin really shouldn't be upset, because passing the entrance exam to the Linnet Academy was an extremely difficult task. So if she wanted to retake the test next year, she should go to her. But at that moment, she saw a girl so happy that she was gloating over the protagonist. The woman responsible for the results told Janet that she had gotten a little mixed up, and it was actually quite different. But at this point, the insanely angry protagonist asked her to stop and not to voice anything. And Janet only smiled at this reaction and said that Ruvia Ruxin must have been madly trying to hide the result, and said that out of respect for her, she decided to bow out and leave. Afterwards, when they were alone, the protagonist apologized and said that she was actually insanely shy, and she was not happy about the fact that she had not had time to enroll and already there were problems. She was about to leave, but at that moment she was stopped by a woman who smiled and said that they had a man who wanted to meet her. And when they met, the protagonist realized that her plan for a carefree 4 years of schooling was completely and utterly ruined, because the headmaster wanted to meet her, who with a smile looking at the main character reported that seeing with his own eyes the person who scored the highest score in the entire story was truly amazing. And the protagonist only awkwardly reflected on the fact that she had founded this academy, but had no idea that the exams would be so difficult for generations to come, and then awkwardly admitted that coming here had inevitably made her life more difficult, and people would not leave alone whoever scored the highest in history. So she carefully circled the man and told him that before they started talking, she wanted to tell them something about her prom, and told him that she was actually very lucky. After all, there were problems she'd answered at random, and then told her that her admission score wasn't an indicator of her knowledge, but a coincidence of circumstance and luck. But the man laughed at such words of the protagonist and informed Ruvia Ruxin not to say anything of the sort about herself, for the girl not only possessed outstanding intelligence, but also extreme modesty, which was simply splendid. Then he said that he just wanted the protagonist to know that the principal was really impressed with more than just her scores. After seeing her answer sheet, it was hard to hide his surprise, because even in short sentences, the essence of the question was clearly formulated, and the answers were even better than the prevailing academic doctrines. And even he found this insanely hard to believe. Just after that literally lit up with enthusiasm, said that for the first time in his entire century, he saw such a talent, and if this is not fate, he literally did not know how to explain it. And at that moment, he realized that before his leftovers were not long. But lastly, he was going to make every effort to reveal the talent of the protagonist. And she just looked at him and realized that the man was unshakable and therefore could not be delayed, and then informed him that she was canceling her application for admission. But at that moment, the man looked at her awkwardly and wondered if he had heard her correctly. But she bowed and said she was terribly sorry that she had misled the principal, but she had to go. The man still asked her why she was doing that. Then Ruvia Ruxin said that she had a chronic illness and had taken the exam with her last strength and had surprisingly gotten a high score. But it seems that studying at the academy will be difficult. And then the principal asked the girl what disease she had, for he wanted to help her. After all, there were many outstanding specialists in the field of medicine at the academy. And then the main character came up with an answer and said that there was one disease that couldn't be cured even on the Western continent, and that was migraine. And she gets headaches and seizures. If it weren't for the headaches, she'd be happy to continue her studies. But alas, you can't. She bowed and told the headmaster that he must have had a lot of things to do and thanked the man for his time. Her enrollment was impossible because of her illness, but the Linnet Academy would always be in her heart. But at that moment, the principal looked her over and said he had an option for her. She could stay, but she wouldn't have to attend classes. And if she promised to attend their academy, he would give her passing grades and make it so that all the homework could be replaced by tests. And then the protagonist, after scrutinizing him, said that although she was madly grateful, it was difficult for her to make any promises. And upon hearing this response, the principal awkwardly asked Lady Ruby to think about it. After all, the ban on expulsion during the school year is a rule that was put in place because of students dropping out after receiving a scholarship. But if the girl wanted to leave, they would not prevent her from doing so. And then she thought about what he said and realized that she couldn't get a better deal. But it really bothers her that she had to make a promise. The laws of this world apply to her. And one of those laws is that if she makes a promise, it becomes a compulsion. And that's because her soul energy is so much stronger than others. And once she makes a promise, she has to fulfill it unconditionally. So she turned around and said that there was no way she could promise him that. And at that moment, the madly sad director said that if that was the conclusion of her doctor, there was really no other choice. Then the protagonist, looking at the frame with the photo, thought that she was insanely ashamed, because the sincerity of this director towards her was not because of personal interests. He was a real teacher, and for the sake of the academy, he tried to keep the outstanding minds. After that, the man said that he was insanely sorry, because people like Ruvia Ruxin graduated from the academy and became irreplaceable in this world. After that, he said that their doors will always be open for her, so they will be waiting. Then a picture appeared in her mind of the man promising her that he would continue to develop the academy and spread the knowledge that the protagonist had left behind. And then she awkwardly thought about the fact that the second director of the academy had the same zeal as the current one. And if you look closely, they even looked a little bit alike. But still, she turned around and said that she had a few conditions, and if the director didn't mind, she could name them. And he literally glowed with happiness and agreed. In the end, after a while, Maria, together with the main character, went into her room, and the girl, literally in shock, looked around and could not believe that they got such a dwelling. This room was completely different from the usual dormitory. Ruvia Ruxin only thought that it was really worth it to come from far away for such conditions. After all, now they could rest in peace. And Maria, only admiringly looking at her mistress, said that she had managed to enter the academy after all, and with the highest score. But after looking at her, attentively inquired, "Why did Ruvia Ruxin ask earlier not to say that she had the best results?" "Because at the beginning of the semester everyone will know about it anyway." But the protagonist quietly said that no one would find out, so Maria had to keep it a secret too. And then she thought she'd put some conditions on the principal. And the first is the ability to leave the academy within a year in case of unforeseen circumstances. The second was to keep her exam results secret, but the principal only frantically inquired why she was so eager to do so. After all, she had the highest score, and it's a hugely significant historical event, and it was obviously going to be publicized. But the protagonist calmly explained that the extra tension would only provoke attacks of her illness, and then stated that although the director resisted, he finally realized that he could not change my conditions. At this point, the main character turned around when she heard Maria crying softly, and then she said that her mistress had the highest score, and she wanted everyone on the continent to know how awesome the girl was. And then the protagonist thought that she was going to live like a sloth anyway, not a real student, so it wouldn't make sense. Although she felt guilty, so she thought she should definitely have pampered Maria a little. But afterwards, she climbed into bed and thought that she would have to slit the headmaster some research paper so that he could use it as an achievement for the academy. And an excited Maria only wondered what her mistress was going to do now. And the girl calmly said she'd be sleeping now. She could do it all the time now, and the girl could wake her up. But she only hesitantly asked why Madam was saying that. After all the other students were walking around before the admission ceremony and looking for new friends, and some had already bonded. But the protagonist calmly declared that geniuses should always be left alone. Although Maria said that even if they were geniuses, they still needed friends. Ruvia Ruxin only said that in that case she would find them later, but for now she was determined to sleep at least a little. 70 hours or so. But Maria was undeterred, and so pulling off her blanket informed her that she urgently needed to find friends, and also a boyfriend. But to hear about friends from Maria was not surprising, but to hear about a guy literally put the girl in shock, and so she wondered what kind of guy it was about. And then Maria said that the fourth prince, who was her fiancé, was studying at this academy, and they were destined for each other. And the main character, literally shaking, asked what Maria had just said and asked her to repeat it. And she reiterated that the fourth prince studied at this academy and he was the headmaster and was in his 4th year. And at that moment, the girl was really shocked. She sat down on the bed and began to think about what had happened and didn't understand why this guy had gone to the Lenin Academy. If he was from the imperial family, he should have stayed in the imperial palace. If the girl had known that she would meet her fiancé so quickly, she would have solved the problem before she left the archduchy. Although she thought that if she had thought about it, there was no reason for her to leave the dormitory at all, because she's graduating in 4 years, and there's a good chance they won't even meet during that time. So I realized that as a runaway princess, the marriage should be declared null and void. But if they don't, she'll figure it out on her own sometime later anyway, and then lay down on her bed and thought that now she would be one with her bed. As a result, after 12 hours, the protagonist woke up only once to drink water and eat bread. 24 hours later, Maria had already tried to wake her up, but Ruvia Ruxin did not submit to this at all. After 48 hours, Maria did everything but could not raise her mistress because she used alarm clocks and objects that make loud noises. And finally, after 72 hours, the girl woke up and was happy to report that she'd finally gotten some sleep. Then she looked at the madly disgruntled Maria, who clearly did not want to talk to her, and then the maid turned away and said that such a genius as the main character should not talk to her at all. And then the girl realized that her maid was clearly madly offended by it. So looking at the girl carefully, I asked her if she would like to eat something tasty today, like strawberry shortcake. But she only refused grudgingly. And at that moment, Ruvia looked away and said that she wanted to go to a restaurant to eat spaghetti with tomatoes and seafood, and on the way back to get some strawberry juice. But since Maria didn't want to, then unfortunately she would have to do it all alone. At this point, the maid did not stand the pressure and ran up and hugged the protagonist, telling her mistress that it was too cruel, but the girl only smiled and told the maid that she really did not have to worry about her so much. Everything was fine, but Dale looked at her carefully and said that she was worried anyway. And then other memories crept into her head as her lover asked how she could not worry about the main character. For as much as a child needed its mother, so much did he need the girl. But then she pushed those thoughts away and looked at Maria and told her to get ready as soon as possible, because if they went out a little later, there would be a lot of people. But the agitated Maria only wondered if the lady had money, but they only had 20 coins left. She was shocked and asked what Maria had eaten while she slept, but she awkwardly said that she had eaten the rest of the buns. Then Ruvia thought about the fact that housing and food were provided only for students. So from now on, the protagonist had to be more careful. Then apologized to Maria for not thinking it through, but she calmly assured her that they needed to apologize because she really liked the buns. But the next moment, Ruvia looked at the girl and asked her if she understood what she was most angry about. Then she explained that she was very angry when people lived in poverty, and if she had a person of her own, she would want that person to live well, to be well fed and clothed, because that's the way it should be. She turned around and told the girl to follow her, but a worried Maria explained that everything was really fine because she just needed to stay close to her mistress to be happy. But then excitedly looked at the fact that the princess had gone to the closet and started looking at her outfits, so the girl wondering where her mistress was going to go. But calmly stated that they would go earn money, then deliver an insanely beautiful burgundy outfit, and said that this time they should get as much money as possible to save for the future. In the end, when they went outside, the main character was looking at different kids who were discussing something or talking and sitting on a bench. And looking at them, Ruvia, I thought that these kids were really insanely chipper, and it looked quite glorious. But at that moment, she shifted her gaze to the frantically agitated Maria and wondered for what reason she was looking at her so intently. But Ruvia calmly explained that perhaps the maid was not mistaken, for she was quite beautiful, and Maria only boiled her head with joy and said that their mistress was the most beautiful girl of all. But afterwards inquired what reason her mistress had for making this particular dress after all. Everyone had been wearing the Academy's formula for a long time, but the protagonist calmly said that it would help them earn money. And then a frightened Maria asked Ruvia if she was going to do something bad, but she calmly explained that the girl should not even think about something like that. But the next moment she heard a shout, one of the girls turning to the other in displeasure, and inquiring what the commoner had allowed herself, and making her apologize. And then this poor student, pressing her hand to her cheek where she had just been hit, apologized. And this bitchy lady just said that the girl could tell she was from a lower class. Looking at this picture, the protagonist immediately realized that it was obvious that one of them was an aristocrat, and who was an ordinary person. And this situation was not surprising at all. But the next moment, that aristocrat struck the girl again, and wondered whether she thought it was an apology, and whether she had been taught such a thing in her house, though she added that it was unlikely she had a home at all. And at that moment, Mary, looking at the whole picture, excitedly asked Ruvia what they should do, but Ruvia calmly inquired as to the reason why Mary had stopped where she was. After all, they were in a hurry, but excitedly the maid only wondered could they not help this commoner in any way. At that moment, the protagonist looked at the aristocrat, who told the girl that her disgusting behavior was in keeping with her origins, and if she really thought she was at fault, she should have knelt down and apologized like a dog. And she only stared at her with tears frozen in her eyes in horror, unable to find the strength to answer, while the aristocrat shouted at her and forced her to do so. At this time, Ruvia explained that Maria was probably well aware that such things happened all the time, and so they couldn't help everyone. Besides, they had nothing to reproach that aristocrat with. After all, differences in origin existed even within the walls of the academy. Maria only sadly agreed. But then Ruvia said with a smile that that was usually the case, but then she realized that the little noblewoman's milk was still wet on her lips. And that was not why the heroine had created the academy. So she told Maria that sometimes such relationships were no more than a whim. So she hid the stone that was under her feet, which immediately flew into the head of that noblewoman, who shouted angrily and wondered who dared to do something like that. But the protagonist calmly looked at her and told her that she had done it. And the aristocrat, in shock, could not believe that it was the princess of the duchy. At that moment, looking at her surprised face, Ruvia only smiled and said that she had not done it on purpose, and asked who had asked the girl to stand in that place. But the aristocrat only grudgingly asked the protagonist to be more careful next time. She agreed, but after looking around her as displeased as possible, she asked why this girl didn't introduce herself and greet her. But that only excited looking at her asked what the protagonist meant, and then she, sure standing in front of her, said that the girl should have greeted her properly, because she perfectly understood who is now in front of her. And then this girl obediently bowed before her and greeted the princess by telling her that she was the daughter of a viscount. And the next moment, the protagonist, haughtily looking over the shaking aristocrat, inquired why, when bending over, her knees were so low-angled, and her left shoulder a little twisted, and why she had put her right hand on her belt, and why the noblewoman seemed to have tilted her head first before bending her back, and wondered if this was a new method of greeting. But she apologized excitedly, and Ruvia said that she would be sure to teach this girl how to bow properly, and told her to bow again. And when she saw her shocked face, she just smiled and said that apparently this girl had not been trained properly, so she would do it, so that she wouldn't make the same mistakes in the future, and she would thank her later. After which the aristocrat bowed, and the protagonist grudgingly said that she should have tilted her head lower, and inquired why this girl was in such a hurry, and explained that the essence of Western behavior is modesty and elegance. And finally, when the noblewoman, already shaking with anger and humiliation, made the correct bow, and Ruvia clapped her hands and said that now everything was correct, and her greeting was in accordance with the rules of etiquette. Then she smiled and said that if this girl wanted to learn something else, she would teach her some lessons. She only bowed excitedly to the protagonist and said that it was really enough and she had urgent business to attend to, so she was forced to leave. And then she ran away. And the protagonist only looked around. Her maid reported that now they could leave, and the latter, enthusiastically looking at her lady, reported that it was really just incredible, and the protagonist had once again conquered her heart. And the protagonist only did not understand where such delight was coming from. But the next moment, the girl who had been beaten by that aristocrat earlier approached her and thanked her for helping her, although they were even strangers. But the protagonist calmly said that she did not do it for her and just wanted to teach this girl a lesson in proper behavior. So she asked the student not to jump to conclusions. She didn't even know that this girl was here, but she just smiled and said that the lady had spoken that way because she didn't want to make her uncomfortable. And then she introduced herself and promised that she would never forget what the protagonist had done for her. In the end, when they said goodbye, Ruvia and Maria moved on, and Maria smiled and asked the protagonist if she really didn't want to help her, even though I could see from her embarrassed face that she did it out of kindness.